All right, Lana, please take over. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third Waste Less Wednesdays social. So happy to have everyone with us today. I'll be your MC today. My name is Bridget Gregory Trites, and I'm the Senior Waste Reduction and Recycling Coordinator at the Johns Hopkins University Homewood Recycling Office. Just to give you a little background on these series, if you're new, each week we'll be joined by a sustainability professional to explore a different topic related to waste. Our host will spend a couple minutes presenting their topic, and then we'll start posing questions to our audience, discussion, and feedback. We are going to pose just two little polling questions right here just for some feedback from our group on who's here. So please go ahead and fill out that. Housekeeping items. Please note that the event today is going to be recorded and will be sent out in the follow-up email coming this Friday. If you do, please introduce yourself into the chat and share what school or organization you're from. Also, again, we're not going to have people raise their hand if they want to talk. Feel free to just unmute yourself. Keep yourself muted when you are not talking to prevent any additional background noise. But if you want to speak, feel free to unmute yourself, be courteous, and feel free to talk. If you'd like to raise your hand and have us call on you, that's fine as well. Otherwise, feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat room, and one of us will keep an eye on it and mention it out loud as well. And again, if you're having any technical issues, please feel free to send me a chat directly in the chat box, Bridget Gregory. With that, I'm just going to keep chugging here today. Today I am joined by Lindsey Hutchison. She is the Senior Zero Waste Coordinator in Resource Recovery, a branch of facility services at the University of Texas at Austin. For 4 years, she has advised the Resource Recovery Student Internship Program, as well as assisting with the development, implementation, and assessment of key zero waste programs. She started with UT in sustainability within housing and dining. Previously, she worked with a nonprofit serving refugees, pursuing agriculture, and as the assistant farm manager. Her degrees are Master of Landscape Architecture and Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies. Lindsey will be leading our discussion today about recycling right, the realities of the recycling system. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and end our poll here. And welcome Lindsey to take the lead.
All right. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you all today. And thanks, Bridget, for that introduction and for hosting. So I work at the University of Texas at Austin. We have a small office focused on zero waste, but we do have lots of fantastic interns that keep my job really exciting. And just wanted to note our campus. It's a big campus, about 70,000 folks. And we focus on about 18 million square feet of classroom and office space for our zero waste programs. We do have a zero waste goal at UT, which is defined as 90% diversion from landfill. And that goal was set in 2000 and more comprehensively addressed in our 2016 Campus Sustainability Master Plan. The goal today is a brief overview of the recycling system to help provide a frame of reference for those recycling rules that you probably hear all the time. We are to try and follow, and to address a few common recycling misconceptions, questions, and then we'll wrap up with some discussion questions to think critically about the recycling system together. So I think you guys have already done the welcome poll that Bridget sent out. On to the next poll here, which is to start about recycling. So let me get that one launched. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that poll up on your screen. And there's some images on the slide to reference for question number 5 and question number 6. Question number 5, that's example of what I'm referring to in terms of cartons. And then for question 6, what those kind of chasing arrow triangle symbols look like on plastic items. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer those questions.
Lindsay, do you want us to answer where we are now or when we were in at our school or institution?
Either way, I think. However you define your community, if you want it to be your campus or your city. All right, so we've got pretty close to full participation on that. I'm not going to address specific answers to these right away, but we'll kind of come back to these different points throughout the presentation. But I'll go ahead and share the results with you guys so you can see what others have said. All right, so returning to our big question of why can't everything be recycled? We're gonna kind of focus on 2 areas, which are financial realities, because recycling is a business, and then the mechanical limitations. All right, so this is a graphic that came from this study, and I'll have a link to it at the end. And it was really looking at recycling as a system, which is a great way to sort of figure out, how can you optimize for kind of all the players and all the partners trying to make this happen. So want to walk through each of these pieces, and we're actually going to move right to left on this graphic, and there is a reason for that, and I'll explain that as I discuss each element. All right, so consumer engagement. This is the piece that you're probably most familiar with. It's things like messaging and infrastructure, like bins and signage, that are consumer facing to get the materials into the bin for collection. And it looks like most of you guys at 92% do have a single stream type collection, which is all of those various recyclables going together into the same bin. Single stream comes from the idea that it should require less sorting by the consumer, so then it should be easier to recycle, so that there'll be higher participation rates. Although there are some detriments to single stream recycling as well, and we'll touch on some of those. And a big one is you don't always get the highest quality material. And it looks like a lot of y'all did pick that out as a possible benefit of collecting single stream. That's sorting effort reduction. All right, so collection is the next piece here. And that's basically like the aggregation of the materials from the community. So there's different ways that this might look. It might be that, like the first picture, as a community member, you're taking it to a drop-off location and kind of sorting it out yourself. Or maybe you put it into your bin and then custodial helps to get that out to dumpsters, or you put out your cart curbside and then a truck comes and picks up that material. The next piece is transportation. So as we saw in the last slide, sometimes this could happen at the consumer/collection step if instead of single stream, your community is practicing source separation. At UT and across Austin, we collect single stream. So that material goes to a place called a MRF, or a materials recovery facility, which sorts the recyclable materials. So they take in this post-consumer material in kind of this unprocessed form where it's mixed together and sorted out, and then they'll sell it to the next entity and ship it out to them. And that entity might be somewhere else across the US or even internationally. MRFs are a for-profit business, and so they typically only wish to sort what they can sell. And so the economics for them are around the speed that they can sort through this material, and then the quantity of the material that they can kind of bundle up to sell and pass on. So historically, they've had these core materials that are reliable sources of income for them. And that's things like cardboard, aluminum cans, steel cans, and different types of plastic like PET and HDPE. Glass, in some markets, it depends. Some places it has a really low market value, and so that's not something that's actually sorted. But what do we notice about that list of materials? They're like one single type of material, not a mix of different types of materials. So that's much easier for them to capture. And MRFs in general are concerned by the market moving away from these types of materials. There's a lot more like flexible film packaging, cartons that have like layers of different types of materials, more mixed paper and 3 through 7 plastics, which have little value in the market. And for a MRF, you can see in these photos that, you know, it's this big industrial equipment. And so it's pretty expensive for them to add new equipment and kind of change over, you know, shut down their sorting line to add or change equipment, especially if a material is relatively low volume for them to try and capture. And let's see, you guys had it, most of y'all, majority had it right that the average contamination rate of US recycling is 25%. So that's a big thing of what they're dealing with and trying to pull out of the recycling stream. All right, the next piece here are reprocessors. So these are industrial businesses that are located domestically or in international countries where the sorted recyclables end up. So they're businesses like plastics reclaimers, glass beneficiators, paper mills, aluminum mills, steel brokers. I believe there's a presentation coming up in this series about China's Green Wall. And so that'll be an example of you know, an entity that buys these materials and is kind of the next step in the process of creating a new material. So these reprocessors like aggregate a certain material and then convert it into a new product with that recycled content. So some examples here of what a reprocessor would do. The first one is repeat. So that is using recycled PET or plastic. And there's you can see different steps that happen at a reprocessor. So they're gonna, you know, remove labels, they're gonna crush and wash and sift out to get a clean material again, and then remake it into something, in this case, a yarn, which can then be utilized to make clothing. And then on the newsprint example, there's a lot of pulping of the paper, putting it through screens, getting out like the ink, like glue, staples, that kind of thing, before it is made back into a sheet that can be reutilized. So a reprocessor is concerned primarily with the yield of a bale, which I'll actually go back a slide here. So this image on the right with some of our students touring the MRF, those are stacks of kind of big sort of cubes of material called a bale. And so the reprocessors are concerned about how much material and the quality of the material that they can get out of that bale. And that's really what their economics are focused on. So any contamination or things that don't belong in that bale costs them money. And sometimes contamination is actually intentional. And that'll probably be in the discussion about the China Green Wall policy as well. Reprocessors can lose between 14 and 37% of the weight of that material in the bale that they paid for due to contamination. And they've been finding that contamination has increased over time. And some of that can be due to a single stream collection where receiving that 25% contamination, and for business reasons, trying to sort of like push that on to somebody else to deal with, because a MRF will have to pay to landfill that material themselves otherwise. So the next piece here is end markets. So that's where the item with recycled content is back on the shelf for sale. So as a tip, if you support recycling, you can further support the industry as a consumer by buying items with recycled content. So I said there was a reason why we looked at the graphic that way, right? Because that's kind of the way that our material flows through the system. But the thing that I think is really interesting about the way it's organized is that it shows kind of how the steps are influenced. So a business or a consumer will demand something with recycled content, and then that drives what types of reprocessors there are. So there's been a growing, there's been an increase, an example in the US of domestic reprocessing of like cardboard and paper, because that's been a really, there's been a strong market for that. And then with all our like shipping that we do, and then that drives what the MRF is going to focus on and sort out. And then that drives kind of the systems we create and the messaging that we do to get those materials collected.
Lindsey, before you move on, can you explain how people know if an item is made of recycled content when they're at the store?
Typically, they will want to make that known because it's seen as adding value to the brand. So I would look on the packaging somewhere and it'll say like made with recycled content or post-consumer content somewhere on that item or on the packaging. That can get a little confusing sometimes. We do a lot of education around that on campus because sometimes like an item that is labeled as compostable or looks very similar to something labeled as compostable just says made with recycled content. And so those aren't equal things. All right. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on the MRFs because if you've ever been to one, and I highly encourage you to if you get the chance, they're really fascinating places. And they are the next step of where our material goes once it leaves campus. And so we do our best, to try and educate people and get them the material that meets their specifications. So we talked about how MRFs are focused on, how much money they can make per ton of material. And that drives what materials are targeted. So they're going to design a system to best optimize the sort and capture of those materials. So I'm going to use our local MRF as my touchstone, which is called Balcones Resources. And they use a combination of mechanical equipment and people to manually separate and optimize the system. All right, so that's another photo there of a bale. Let's see. Okay, So the last couple of years, we've taken a group of incoming engineering students to Balcones, and we've learned some really cool things about the equipment that they use. So let's see what you guys thought of when single stream recycling started. 1990s, you guys got it right. Okay, so the first single stream recycling facility was in Arizona in 1993. So really in the grand scheme of things, single stream recycling is not that old. I remember the transition between sorting out my paper and plastic into different bins and taking off the caps from bottles and that kind of thing, to now being able to put it all together into the same bin. As I mentioned, this equipment is very expensive. And so what the recycling industry has done is repurposed equipment from other industries and adapted it to their use. So for example, disc screeners, like the photo on the right, allows small items to fall through, but keeps like 2D paper products and larger things flowing across the top. And that was borrowed from the logging industry and how they debark trees. So that's the equipment photo on the left side. So the discs on these disc screeners are spinning. And so their nemesis is stuff like hoses and plastic bags that wrap up around them. And that requires all the equipment to be shut down. The sorting line stops. People have to go into this dangerous area and like hand cut out this material. So it's really important to keep that kind of stuff out of your recycling. Another adaptation at Balcones was the introduction of robots. And this isn't, this picture is to give you an idea, but not the actual robots that they're using. But the robots were originally used in Frito-Lay facilities to identify potato chips that were overcooked and to remove them from the assembly line. And so they were able to reteach the robots to identify different types of plastics so that they could better capture that valuable material for them. And then I believe they use a puff of air once it's been identified to then shoot the plastic off and separate it out. So one other piece of equipment I wanted to highlight that's kind of a major element uses cool science. So it's to sort out different types of metals. So there's a magnetic drum that's used that will kind of magnetize with ferrous metal and capture that content. And then there is something called an eddy current separator, which will create these repulsive forces, which can actually throw the non-ferrous metal past this gap. If you can see that on the right side of the diagram, where then the other material would kind of fall into that gap, so it gets sort of separated out from each other. So I think this is something whenever people first learn it, I know that was my experience, kind of this whoa moment. So the symbol that's on a plastic item does not necessarily mean that it is recyclable. And you guys are kind of tied at no and maybe. So to me, the maybe answer was that in some places you guys can recycle like some numbers, like maybe 1 and 2, but not all numbers. So it might depend on what the number is. And then, yeah, but really the key takeaway is that just seeing that number doesn't mean that it can automatically be recycled. These are resin identification codes. So it's basically used by the MRF or by the reprocessor to know what kind of resin or plastic was utilized in making that item. So let me show some examples here. So here's an example of one of those like air pack kind of air pillows, and it's got the number 2 HDPE symbol on there. But probably for most of y'all, that's something that can't go into your single stream because those types of film plastics are going to be the things that like wrap up around that sorting equipment. And another example is a number 6 polystyrene. And again, that can't go into our single stream recycling because kind of has a tendency, you know, that styrofoam to just break apart and cause a huge mess. All right, so some of the, so we've talked about how the average recycling contamination rate is 25%. So, you know, MRFs are having to deal with a lot of this. And some of the issues that causes for them, right, is that the films and flexible packaging, you know, can kind of wreak havoc, and that they're a growing presence in terms of their use in packaging products, you know, the types of things you buy at the grocery store. And then here's, again, kind of the mixed packaging, like the cartons. And let's see, we've got a mix of folks saying, yes, they can recycle cartons, no, they can't, and unsure if they can. So I believe that some items like Tetra Paks can be recycled more on the West Coast because it's more convenient to get them to reprocessors. But for balconies, it's too expensive to ship that material a long distance. So it doesn't make economic sense for them to recycle it here. And it's just harder to pull apart the different layers of different types of materials to actually recycle them. There is an entity though called the Carton Council, which is sort of lobbying for the industry to accept these more widely. So you might see changes in the future about whether or not it's accepted. Full body shrink sleeves can cause an issue. We've got a lot of like microbreweries in Austin, and as they're just kind of getting started, it's less expensive instead of printing their labels on cans to buy these sleeves that go around the can. But for example, those robots would see that outer material, which is that plastic, and missort it instead of putting it in with aluminum. And then the MRF is having trouble capturing that really valuable aluminum material. And then another area is liquids and grease. We looked a little bit at kind of that reprocessing cycle for the newsprint, and liquids, like if you are collecting single stream and you've still got some, you know, drink in your bottle or in your cup, then that can spill out and ruin the quality or decrease the quality of the paper that's in the bin. And then things like grease are just hard to kind of separate out from the paper fibers during the recycling process. So really important kind of overarching thing to remember here is to learn the rules of your local community about what you can and can't recycle. I threw this in. This is a chart that was created by one of our student interns. We have a sort of educational and experiential certificate on campus called Zero Waste Hero. And for some people, this is kind of overwhelming. And for others, it's sort of like, this is what I've always wanted. But the idea here is to sort of mock up how, as sort of like recycling experts, we think through, instead of, you know, we kind of apply the rules, I guess, rather than memorizing a specific list of items. So we look at, you know, what is something made out of, kind of what is the size of it, is it greasy, is it painted, like those kinds of characteristics to then determine if it should end up in recycle, compost, or landfill. So I mentioned that study when we were looking at the pieces of the recycling system, and these are a few recommendations that they have, and I'll have again the link to sort of the full report so you can see additional, but I thought this was interesting for all of us as people who care about recycling industry, who maybe want to advocate for change in the recycling industry, or might be doing research in labs or in school. And so some different ways that you could maybe help intervene and make some improvements. So I'll just highlight a few things. So infrastructure interventions include researching the infrastructure needs for a MRF to recover flexible film packaging, and community interventions like additional investments in collection, access, capture rates, that kind of thing. So here's a list of resources. I forgot to mention on the slide talking about the resin identification codes, those chasing arrow symbols with the number in them, that this Frontline Plastic Wars documentary is really interesting and covers that and kind of like how they originated. And it was really like in conversations with the plastic industry itself. And probably there was, you know, kind of some greenwashing there where they were aware that it was going to be a confusing symbol for people. But, you know, in the end, it would kind of benefit them because people would be kind of more open to using single-use plastic if they thought it could be recycled. So that's kind of an additional interesting information if you want to explore that topic further. And then I've got my email on there if you have any questions or comments. So with that, we have some discussion questions. So we'd love for folks to jump in. The first one, we can go in any order really if you see one that stands out to you. But how do you assess whether an item is recyclable or not?
So I think that is a great question, and I love your infographic with all the crazy arrows and everything, because there are times when I think a lot of people are like, this looks like it's recyclable, but I don't know. And I think so many people these days are afraid to put things in the wrong bin that they get like stuck in this situation where they are at the bin and they're like, oh, I don't know what to do. And it's almost like, just throw it away because I don't want to do the wrong thing. So one of the things that I look at, especially if it's plastic, because I feel like plastic is honestly one of the most perplexing things when it comes to, is it recyclable or not, right? Like paper, generally yes, but plastic is like, what? I look at the flimsiness of it. Like, is it sturdy? Is it hard? Or is it flimsy? If it's hard, it's most likely going to make it to the MRF. If it's flimsy, definitely not. And then the other thing that we've been talking about a lot recently is the mouth. So for Baltimore, and for specifically Hopkins, you want to be looking at the mouth of a jar, a plastic jar or bottle. So if it has like a screw top, it's probably a 1 or a 2, and it can go into our recycling bin. Is there anything you'd add to that, Leanna?
Yeah, I was actually just I thought it was really interesting, Lindsay, that your example of the air pillows. So, you know, yeah, the bane of the existence of all MRFs are those, you know, the film plastics, stretchy plastics, and a lot of those have a 1 or a 2 on them. And so after National Sword, we had to completely revamp our signage and do all new outreach tabling, like videos, everything we possibly could do to re-educate everybody about the changes. And we, you know, really, you know, there's only so much you can put on a sign. People say there's not enough on the sign, there's too much on the sign. Like, we know people look at the signs for like 3 seconds if they even look at them. So, so we really pushed the, like what Bridget said, is we said number 1 and 2, but we specifically said bottles and jugs. And that is way more, I think, easy to remember for people. Because one, most people don't want to flip things over to look for a number. And that just simplified it, a lot more for them. And we did also, add some language on our signs that said, you know, when in doubt, throw it out, because we were so impacted by, you know, like 4 compactors, I think 4 compactor loads of recycling that got rejected. So we were like, you know what, we're not fooling around. If you don't know, don't worry about it. We'd rather lose 1 or 2 things than 4 tons of recycled material. So so I think the shapes is definitely a good way to describe it for people.
I'd love
There's
to hear some of
I'll-
y'all if you find that guidance helpful, or what guidance you find helpful.
before we get too far, I want to notice some of the comments in the chat. Somebody asked about shredded paper, and Bridget just said, you know, paper is pretty much a given. You can always recycle paper, but then you think, well, oh yeah, shredded paper. So what is your advice on shredded paper? Somebody from Baltimore County responded and somebody from Austin responded. So what are your thoughts, Lindsay?
We've actually had some updates to how we handle shredded paper. Initially, we were guiding people to compost it unless they had a contract for confidential document campus, but then to look into the entity that they had the contract with and make sure that they were recycling it. This kind of gets to question number 2 in the discussion, that there are some materials that are recyclable, but not via single stream. Shredded paper, if it's kind of like all bundled together into the bale already and delivered to the MRF, they don't have to run that through the sort equipment. And so then they can, you know, just resell that as already a clean material. On our campus, we like to stay in contact with our MRF and make sure we're messaging correctly. And they recently told us that they can identify a bag that is just shredded paper and pull that out and set it to the side and still capture it. So we've been able to update that guidance, which is helpful because we still don't have composting kind of 100% across campus. So it allows people to more easily divert that material.
Yeah. We actually switched back to dual stream. We had sort of a hybrid system on the Hopkins campus where most locations, all of the dining and residence hall facilities were single stream, just out of space and the lack of, you know, paper generated in those spaces. But we have since moved back, except for in the residence halls, which we don't have 100% control over. We've moved back to dual stream, mainly for the greater opportunity for MRFs. We had such a shrinkage of who was going to take our single stream recycling that we just went ahead and went to dual stream. So on our campus, you could put shredded paper into the paper bin and it wouldn't be an issue. And then there was another, this is always a big question that we get, is how clean do the jars need to be?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's always something that you can't get like a really, you know, concrete, straight answer from the MRFs on. But in general, if you can, at least for us, UT and Austin, if it can be sort of like scraped off, wiped off, you know, rinsed out, empty, it doesn't have to be sort of like 100%, but, you know, kind of the closest you can get to that is great. And some of the reason for that is that, like if you send a peanut butter jar half full of peanut butter still, that it's going to be hard for the systems that they have, you know, they're calibrated to what, you know, they kind of most expect that item to be. And so, you know, typically a empty plastic container is pretty lightweight and they can use air and, you know, and send it off the conveyor belt. But if it's, you know, really heavy with all that material in, then it's not going to sort of be able to be sorted. And then sometimes, like we talked about with the liquid and the grease, it can just kind of, you know, reduce the quality of that material and not make it really like recycling friendly as it's being reprocessed and remade into something else.
I have a comment or like a question about that kind of. I've always kind of debated whether or not to seriously work on cleaning an item to be able to recycle it, because then there's water waste and there's all these different types of waste. So I don't know, sometimes I go back and forth. I'm like, should I clean this? Or I like try to use like dirty dishwater, but it just like doesn't work out. So I don't know, it's always, I guess, a debate for me whether to or not, but that's just an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, in Austin especially, sometimes, especially during the summer, you know, we have droughts and there's restrictions on how often you can water your yard, and you know, so we're conscious about the amount of water that we use. So I think your suggestion of, finding ways that you can maybe sort of reuse water. I like to do that too, like set a can in my sink or something. And then as I'm rinsing or washing my hands, the water is getting into that and kind of cleaning it out over time.
Yeah. Or if I have like a bowl I need to soak, then I'll just use that water. It's a whole process.
Yeah. And I think, you can always think about not needing water, but clean, empty, and wiped, so you could wipe something with a dishcloth that you're ultimately going to, rinse for washing something else. It doesn't have to be actually rinsed. It could just be wiped. Yeah. And I would say, if any, those tiny spatulas that you can use for cooking, just get right. It doesn't matter how much water you use, you'll never get a peanut butter jar clean. Yeah. If you want to scrape it, that's one thing. But even then, I don't always know that that's going to work. But you can, those are really great tools too, to just use those to scrape the inside of something. And again, it doesn't have to be spick and span clean. It just needs to be, relatively empty. And again, kind of going back to Lindsay's whole point is that, there is a value assigned to each of these types of materials. And if it's really dirty, all of the labor that's going to go into a MRF or a processor cleaning something is less value that they're going to be able to monetize, into selling that product or the margin, their margin of profit that they're going to have to eat into, which is, again, that's one of the reasons why we're not allowed to bag our recycling anymore. You probably were able to put your recycling in bags before, and now you can't. And that's because it was costing the MRF money to rip the bag open and then dispose of the bag. And as the value of the commodity shrank, that was eating into their profit. So then they passed that on to us, that labor onto us.
Wow. Thank you guys so much.
One of the questions I want to get, there's two that I'm like, oh, yes. One is single stream collection best system. So I feel like for some places it totally is. So if you have a MRF that can actually accommodate single stream well, like it sounds like yours does, Lindsay, then that is totally the best way to go, because you can probably collect the most amount. You'll probably get the most amount of buy-in and participation from your community if you can do it. However, like as you said, that equipment is really expensive, and if it breaks down, there's so many components, it can be a huge issue. And so for us, we don't have a option for single stream. So we used to have single stream where people would it would be like hand-picked labor through. But now if people are from JHU here, you'll start to notice more and more that we are adding like an extra paper bin everywhere on the Homewood campus, because we're trying to only collect plastic and aluminum in one container and paper completely separate, and then of course compost and then the incinerate waste. So very interesting. Anyone else have thoughts on single stream versus dual stream? Pros, cons?
One question I have for you guys doing a dual stream is ease or difficulty of, if you want to add an item to capture for recycling, how hard it is to, do you, like, I think you said you have plastic and aluminum combined together in the same bin. But if you need to add a new bin, versus, I guess we could just update our signage for the one bin.
Well, I would say that it was like, it's paper and like containers. So so anything that's not fiber would go into the same bin. We just recently, last May, had to eliminate glass. That was no longer accepted by our MRF. So, so we do, we have to update our signs, and it does end up, taking a lot of time and energy. Believe me, we think we finished it up right before we all went home from COVID, but yeah, so it definitely, you know, it does affect that. But in terms of adding any other kind of material that we would accept, it would likely not be an additional bin. It would just be a change in the signage. The other reason why I always supported dual stream is just the higher quality product. And so when you're talking about recycling, and I mean, the whole idea of recycling is to limit the virgin material that you are mining or, you know, drilling for, or, you know, whatever virgin material that we're pulling out of the earth to make something. The more post-consumer recycled content that we can have in it, the less that we have to do that. And the more processors are much more likely to use post-consumer recycled content if it is a really high quality. So you want the highest best use, right? So office paper, you want office paper to turn into new office paper. You don't want office paper to turn into toilet paper and then it's done for. So when we have dual stream and we have paper separate, now we did always have a problem with paper coffee cups and coffee getting in there, but I think we've pretty much mostly gotten rid of that problem. But theoretically, all that paper is going to be clean and dry. And so that paper is much more likely to be made into something that's a higher quality that then can be recycled again, as opposed to downcycled into something that's lower quality, like toilet paper or paper towels, that's probably ultimately going to not be, you know, composted or recycled. So so that was the other main reason for me to really hold on to dual stream, you know, and then ultimately bring it back. Any other questions from the folks on?
Or comments? I saw Christine, Larson said dual stream is best in her opinion. Less contamination.
There was a really interesting comment about whether we should do life cycle analysis to decide whether or not it's worth it to recycle certain items. What are your thoughts on that, Lindsay? I have a comment I'll make later after you're done about styrofoam or polystyrene.
Yeah, so question number 6 I had for you guys was, would a plastic or a glass bottle be better for the environment? Maybe sort of stepping back and, you know, thinking sort of bigger picture first is sort of a question of like, do you take into account, you know, how that packaging is going to be disposed of at the end of when you're going to purchase something. There is definitely a lot of considerations, and there can be the calculation in an end of or life cycle analysis can really change, you know, depending on maybe the amount of transportation you have to get it to your recycler, get it to the reprocessor, and that kind of thing. But I think it's I feel like that's kind of like the next step of, you know, kind of ensuring that we are, you know, using items, materials the best that we can be. And then, yeah, starting to look at maybe question number 5, which is like, you know, better ways to reduce waste than relying on recycling.
Yeah, I'll just mention our polystyrene example. You know, we have lots of labs, and styrofoam, as it's better well known, is, you know, seen to be this evil thing. And I think in, you know, many regards it is. In terms of waste, it's not actually one of our biggest issues. It's very voluminous. It's mostly air. It's, you know, EPS, expanded polystyrene, is just full of air. And so to collect a bunch of polystyrene takes a lot of space, but once it's compressed for recycling, it's actually a very small amount. And so it's very lightweight, also doesn't really impact our recycling numbers. But oh my gosh, lab people really want to recycle their polystyrene. They feel so bad about it because so much of their material comes in polystyrene. So it was something that we struggled with, but we ultimately did collect it because we have a facility just over the Pennsylvania line that would take our polystyrene. And so I think if we had to ship it farther, it would definitely I'd have to think twice about whether or not it was worth collecting it and shipping it in diesel trucks that are going to emit greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and contribute more to climate change than the benefit of recycling. So yeah, it's a challenge, but we ultimately decided to continue recycling it because it didn't have to go very far.
That's a really good point. I'm seeing people in the chat talk about, let's see. Lynn King is mentioning, don't forget to avoid and refuse, which kind of gets back to your question number 5 about, is there better ways to reduce or manage waste? So, my thing is always going back to that old adage, reduce, reuse, then recycle. I think so often we just focus on the recycle that we forget about the other 2 R's. And so, it is really important for our purchasing department school to focus on reducing or focus on reusing what you can already before you go to the recycling part. Somebody said,
yeah, and in fact we've added a lot of R's too.
Oh yeah.
We think, redesign, refuse, like Lynn mentions. There's a whole lot more we can do above that line of recycling. Recycling really should be the absolutely last
case
option. And for now, the worst case would be incineration or landfilling. But hopefully with, opportunities of, redesigning materials that we, the worst thing that we could do is recycle. That would be great.
That raises a really good point that by the time we buy something at the store, we're kind of like the last piece in that product's, kind of the system of that product. So in some ways, like, we don't have a lot of influence other than, getting it into the recycle bin. And a lot of kind of the impact of the item has already been predetermined by like the manufacturing of it and all of that. So, we really need to sort of step up advocacy and, influencing business. There's a lot of growth with that with entities like Loop that are looking at some big brands using reusable, refillable containers, which is really exciting.
That's a great segue to some of our other programs. Go ahead, Bridget.
Yeah, actually. So tomorrow, if anybody is from DHU, otherwise I'm going to put it in the chat room. So I will go ahead and do that because I was going to do it later. We are actually hosting a TerraCycle and Loop event. So if you are curious about learning how to recycle some hard to recycle items or buy items that are in reusable packaging, you should attend our Lunch and Learn tomorrow. It's at noon Eastern time, and I have my links here. Let me just pull it up. And
while Bridget's doing that, I'll plug our event on Tuesday, which is talking about how sometimes zero waste can be a little bit overwhelming for people. Like, I can't do it all. So we're talking about less waste. Let's start with less waste, and let's start to think about ways that we can swap out things. So we're gonna, it'll be at
7:30 Eastern time
on Tuesday night. And we're gonna talk a lot about swaps. How can we swap things out and make our lives more sustainable by not even have to worry about whether or not it's recyclable or it's incinerate or it's landfill, that we're just not even generating any waste at all. And we're gonna just cover a full range of things. We're moving beyond mugs and straws and bags.
On that topic, I kind of had a doubt from a behavioral point of view. Like, I know we had previously talked about, single stream or dual stream, but in terms of the actual setup of trash, recycle, and compost, what did you think was, in your guys' experiences, a good setup? So in the UHS where I work in the non-clinical spaces, we have this large recycle bin, but then a tiny it's kind of attached to the recycle bin, like a tiny little trash basket, and it's I guess to encourage more people to recycle, which has kind of been met with mixed reactions.
You want to start that, Lindsay?
So you're asking what is sort of the ideal like bin setup?
Sure, yeah. Like, what have you seen? Like, oh, this is good, and we get least contamination in this, or people are more receptive to, I guess, from a behavior point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know that you're actually on the UT campus. So yeah, those mini bins have been shown to help collect more recycling, like you mentioned, and cleaner recycling, because the fact that you just have a really small trash can kind of makes you think twice about what you put in there, instead of, kind of mindlessly disposing of things. But yeah, it does require a little bit more maybe like interaction if it gets filled up and you have to, carry it over to a bigger container to empty it out or something like that. Yeah, I mean, there's other sort of best practices and studies that have shown some things that work better, like color coding of bins to try and standardize and kind of reinforce, visual cues around which bin to use. On campus, we're also trying to standardize kind of the order of the bins, from left to right. So you always find the bin in the same place, and that the bins are together in sort of a station. So you have the option of whatever stream you want to dispose of. Other things too, like restricted openings on bins, can help people sort of visually start to notice a difference in bins and think twice about where they're putting something.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, on our side, it's really important for us to try and make the system as easy for people to interact with as possible.
I know one of the things that we've talked about in previous Waste Less Wednesdays is, it's now the time to pull out or remove desk side trash bins completely, since we're kind of getting used to taking care of our own trash at home while we've been quarantined and not on campus in our actual offices, and not sure if that will work, but it'd be an interesting idea to see if people would voluntarily be like cool with that. I don't know.
Yeah,
Well,
I just really quickly say, we have a challenge on campus where, we have a pretty good composting program, but are not very much likely to not put compost bins desk side. They have that at one of our schools of public health. But, the question, you start to ask the question, like, do we just continue to make it convenient for people at their desk and add bins, or do you start to remove them and force everybody to take, make it very convenient for them to take those items to a central location where they have every option as opposed to just one or two options? So, I think that there's a great debate on, and both have been very successful and both have probably had some failures. So I think it depends on the culture of your school a lot.
Well, it is just about 5 o'clock East Coast time. So I am going to put out our last set of polls. Thank you all for staying with us this evening. And thank you so much for leading this awesome discussion. I think a lot of people learned a lot about the recycling system and the restrictions and why those are there. I loved seeing those pictures about the Murph and the robot. That was really cool. If you get a chance, please fill out those polls. I am going to share my screen real quick and do a promo for next week's Waste Less Wednesday. We have Margaret Bounds from the College of Connecticut going to speak next Wednesday about child and parent waste. Should be a really interesting conversation about all of the intricate components that come with all of the toys and packaging and food, and really more geared to home life now with having a kid in the house. So please join us next week. Otherwise, keep an eye out for our follow-up emails, and thank you. We'll see you guys soon. Have a great evening.
Thanks. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.